9 scans, 9 clean reads, 0 flags. For 14 months, the same refrigerated trailer rolled across the Pharr International Bridge every Tuesday morning. And every single time, the X-ray came back the same. Uniform pallets, even density, nothing worth a second look. On paper, it was the safest truck on that bridge. In the trailer's front housing, packed inside the refrigeration unit itself, sat compressed bricks of fentanyl worth more than $500 million over the life of the route. What finally cracked the case wasn't a scanner. It was a repair bill. A maintenance shop in Pharr, Texas, billed that trailer for a compressor rebuild on a day when every other record said the truck was 400 miles north, in San Antonio. One number didn't match. That's it. That's the whole crack in the wall. An FBI financial analyst named Elena Marsh found it buried in a stack of filings she wasn't even supposed to be looking at, and by the time she finished pulling the thread, it led to 14 indictments, 2.1 tons of fentanyl, and a rewrite of how 3 Texas border crossings scan incoming cargo. This is the story of how a smuggling cell beat the machines built to catch them, for over a year, using nothing more exotic than papaya and patience. And it's the story of the one piece of paper they didn't think anyone would read closely enough to notice. Stick around, because the part where the case actually breaks isn't a raid. It's a woman with a highlighter, cross-referencing a shell company's tax filings against a fuel card statement at 11 at night, and she almost didn't bother finishing the page. Reynosa, Mexico, sits across the Rio Grande from Pharr, Texas, connected by a bridge that moves more produce trucks per day than almost any land port on the southern border. Onions, melons, papaya, avocados, millions of dollars in fresh cargo cross every 24 hours, and every truck gets weighed against risk. Carriers with clean histories, consistent manifests, and low violation records get waived through non-intrusive inspection faster. Carriers with red flags get pulled apart pallet by pallet. A produce broker in Reynosa named Marcos Villarreal ran a company called Rio Fresh Produce, and on paper, Rio Fresh was boring in the best possible way. Clean customs history, timely paperwork. A fleet of 6 refrigerated trailers that had never once triggered a full secondary inspection in 3 years of operation. Villarreal wasn't hauling papaya because he loved the produce business. He was hauling papaya because a boring business is the best cover a smuggling cell can buy. Behind Villarreal sat a Gulf Cartel logistics commander named Ramiro Zavala, known inside the organization as El Comandante, who ran the cross-border movement for a faction controlling roughly 40 miles of the Reynosa-McAllen corridor. Zavala didn't touch product. He touched systems. He understood inspection rotations, officer shift patterns, and something most smugglers ignore entirely, the actual physics of an X-ray scanner. That understanding came from a man named Hector Salinas, an engineer with a background in refrigeration systems who cartel investigators would later describe, almost admiringly, as the best in the business at solving one specific problem. How do you hide dense, compressed narcotics inside a moving vehicle in a way that a gamma-ray scan reads as ordinary machinery? Salinas studied leaked scanner output. Some of it came from a corrupted source inside the inspection chain, a detail that wouldn't surface until much later in the investigation. He learned that a trailer's evaporator housing, the metal casing at the front of a refrigerated unit that holds coils, fans, and compressor components, produces a naturally dense, irregular signature on an X-ray. Coils inside coils, metal against metal. It's supposed to look complicated. Salinas built a cavity inside that housing, engineered so that compressed fentanyl bricks, wrapped and shaped to mimic refrigerant lines, would blend into the noise the scanner already expected to see. He tested it. It worked. And Villarreal's Tuesday truck became the proof of concept for what would grow into a much larger cold chain smuggling pipeline. Why Tuesdays specifically? That question would come up again and again over the life of the investigation, and the eventual answer surprised even the agents who found it. The driver behind the wheel most weeks was a 34-year-old named Ruben Ortiz, a man with a commercial license, a wife, and 2 kids in Reynosa. and a debt to Zavala's organization that started small and never stopped growing. Ortiz wasn't cartel leadership. He wasn't even mid-level. He was a man who needed money and agreed to drive a specific truck on a specific day, and told himself, for a while, that not knowing exactly what was inside the housing counted as a kind of innocence. It didn't, but that's a separate conversation. By late 2023, the Tuesday trailer had crossed the bridge dozens of times. Federal agents in the Rio Grande Valley sector had no idea it existed. Cartel-linked cold chain smuggling wasn't new to them. Refrigerated produce trucks had been used to move drugs across South Texas checkpoints for over a decade. What made this operation different was its restraint. No large seizures to chase. No informants flipping because nobody involved knew enough to flip. Just one truck, one schedule, one company, moving quietly under a system built to flag exactly the kind of behavior this cell refused to exhibit. Here's the detail that changes how you see the first 10 months of this case. The investigation that eventually caught the trailer didn't start as a drug case at all. It started as a financial crimes review of unrelated trucking companies suspected of misusing pandemic-era small business relief funds. Elena Marsh, an FBI financial analyst working out of the Bureau's McAllen field office, was assigned to comb through tax filings and vendor invoices for a batch of trucking-adjacent businesses across the Rio Grande Valley. Rio Fresh Produce wasn't even her primary target. A repair shop that serviced Rio Fresh's trailers was. That shop, Valley Cold Chain Repair, showed up on her list because it had filed for a relief loan using inflated payroll numbers. A garden variety fraud case, the kind that fills a quiet Tuesday on any financial crimes desk. Marsh started pulling invoices to verify the payroll claims against actual work performed, and that's when she noticed something that had nothing to do with the loan fraud she was chasing. I spent hours going through those filings later, once the case was public, and one detail kept nagging at me the way it clearly nagged at her. Valley Cold Chain Repair had billed Rio Fresh Produce for a full compressor rebuild on a specific reefer trailer. Invoice dated September 17, 2024. Standard job. Standard price, $4,200. Nothing suspicious on its face. Except Marsh had also pulled electronic logging device records for that same trailer as part of a routine cross-check, and those records placed the truck 400 miles north, parked at a distribution yard in San Antonio on September 17, 2024. A truck cannot be in a repair bay in Pharr and a parking lot in San Antonio on the same day. One of those records was fiction. She almost skipped it. That's the part that gets me. It was one line on one invoice in a stack of hundreds, attached to a fraud case about payroll numbers, not drug trafficking. Most analysts would have flagged the payroll issue and moved on. Marsh flagged the date mismatch instead, mostly out of habit, and asked for one more data pull before closing her notes for the night. That pull was the fuel card statement. Rio Fresh Produce ran its fleet on a company fuel card program, the kind that logs every swipe with a timestamp and a location. Marsh requested 12 months of transaction history for the trailer in question and found 47 fuel card swipes at a single truck stop chain in Alton, Texas, roughly 6 miles from the Pharr Bridge. All 47 fell on a Tuesday. Not one swipe existed anywhere near San Antonio, ever, on any date. The truck the invoice claimed was in San Antonio for a rebuild had, according to its own fuel records, never left the Rio Grande Valley. That's when this stopped being a loan fraud case. Marsh brought her findings to Special Agent Carlos Rivera, a case agent with the FBI's McAllen field office who'd spent 6 years working cartel-linked financial networks along the border. Rivera's first reaction, by his own account in later testimony, was skepticism. A mismatched invoice could mean sloppy bookkeeping. It could mean nothing. Cartels don't usually leave paper trails this clumsy, and Rivera had chased enough dead-end leads to be cautious about calling this one different. What changed his mind wasn't the one invoice. It was the pattern underneath it. Rivera pulled every invoice Valley Cold Chain Repair had issued over 18 months. 14 separate trucking-adjacent businesses across the valley had paid the shop for repair work, and a disproportionate number of those invoices when checked against ELD and fuel card data, described work performed on trucks that weren't where the paperwork said they were. The amounts varied: $3,800 here, $5,100 there, but the pattern held. Valley Cold Chain Repair wasn't just fixing trucks. It was issuing invoices as a delivery mechanism for cash that had nothing to do with refrigeration. Here's what that tells us about how far cash laundering has evolved on the border. Wire transfers get flagged. Cash deposits over $10,000 trigger currency transaction reports. But a repair invoice for parts and labor, paid by a produce broker to a legitimate-looking repair shop, moves real money through a real business with a real tax ID, and nobody at a bank is trained to ask whether a compressor rebuild actually happened. The system built to catch financial crime was watching for the wrong shape of transaction entirely. Rivera's theory, which his team would spend the next several months trying to prove, was that Valley Cold Chain Repair functioned as a payment laundering front for Zavala's logistics network. Drivers and brokers got paid in cash. Disguised as repair costs, the produce companies then wrote off as ordinary business expenses. It was elegant, it was boring, and boring, on the border, is exactly what gets missed. The case was over as a loan fraud investigation. It was just beginning as something much larger. Rivera's team needed more than a mismatched date and 47 fuel receipts. They needed to establish, with enough certainty to support a Title III wiretap application, that Rio Fresh Produce's Tuesday trailer was actually moving narcotics and not just laundering cash through a crooked repair shop for some other, less dramatic reason. That meant physical surveillance. And physical surveillance meant time nobody wanted to spend without more justification than a suspicious invoice. For nearly 3 months, agents watched Villarreal's warehouse on the far side of the bridge from a pole camera installed on a utility easement half a block away. They watched a loading dock. They watched pallets of papaya go in and out on a schedule, so regular it was almost soothing. No visible handoffs, no suspicious visitors, no informant willing to talk, because as far as anyone could tell, nobody working the warehouse floor knew what was riding inside that evaporator housing. 3 months of surveillance produced a great deal of very ordinary footage and nothing resembling probable cause. That's the obstacle nobody talks about in these cases. Not gunfights, not car chases. Just months of watching a boring building do boring things, waiting for one crack of daylight to show through. The break came sideways, the way these things usually do. Rivera's team obtained a Title III wiretap authorization not on Villarreal, but on the owner of Valley Cold Chain Repair, a man named Osvaldo Peña, based on the financial fraud evidence Marsh had already built. Wiretaps on financial crimes are easier to justify than wiretaps on drug trafficking when the drug trafficking is still theoretical. Peña wasn't a cartel member. He was a business owner drowning in debt to the wrong people, and drowning men talk on the phone more than they should. Over 6 weeks of intercepted calls, Peña never once said the word fentanyl. He didn't have to. What he said, repeatedly, to a contact investigators identified as working directly for Zavala, was a phrase that would become the emotional center of the entire case file. Nobody counts the parts. They just pay the bill. He said it almost proudly, like a man who'd solved a problem clever enough to admire. He was describing, in his own words, exactly how the laundering scheme worked, and he had no idea a federal wiretap was capturing every syllable. Something about that phrase still doesn't sit right, even now, months after the case became public. A man bragging about how easy it is to move cartel money through invoices nobody checks, not realizing the people checking had finally started checking. There's a strange arrogance to it. There's also something almost sad. Peña wasn't a mastermind. He was a small business owner who found a way to stay afloat by becoming a laundering machine for people who would have discarded him in a heartbeat the moment he became inconvenient. The wiretap nearly collapsed twice. The first time, Peña grew suspicious of a parked van outside his shop that had been there for 11 straight days and switched to a burner phone mid-investigation, cutting agents off from his communications for nearly 3 weeks, while Rivera's team scrambled to identify the new number through a confidential source close to the repair shop's supply chain. The second time, a hurricane advisory for the Rio Grande Valley in late September 2024 forced the temporary evacuation of the surveillance team's fixed monitoring post, leaving a 4-day gap in coverage during which agents could only pray nothing critical happened. Nothing did, but Rivera would later admit those 4 days were the longest of the entire case. By October, the wiretap had given investigators something they didn't have before: names, dates, and a rough map of how far the laundering network extended beyond one repair shop. It hadn't yet given them fentanyl. That required getting back to the bridge, and back to the machine that had failed 9 times already. The Tuesday trailer had crossed at Pharr on a fixed weekly schedule since at least mid-2023, according to reconstructed crossing records. Every crossing went through the same non-intrusive inspection process: a drive-through X-ray booth that produces a density image of the trailer's cargo without unloading it. CBP officers reviewing those images look for anomalies: dense clusters where there should be uniform product, voids where there should be mass, shapes that don't match a manifest. 9 separate times, officers reviewing the Tuesday trailer's scan saw a refrigeration unit that looked exactly like a refrigeration unit. That wasn't officer error. That's the uncomfortable part of this story, and it's worth saying plainly. Salinas had engineered the hide specifically to defeat the equipment CBP already had in place at Pharr. The scanners weren't broken. They were reading exactly what they were built to read, and what they were built to read had been deliberately manipulated to look normal. Here's the take that'll probably get us some pushback, and we'll say it anyway. This wasn't a failure of the officers working the booth. It was a failure of procurement and inspection design, sitting several levels above any single CBP officer's desk. Pharr Bridge was, at the time, running scanner technology that had been in continuous service for years without a corresponding upgrade in density resolution software, even as smuggling engineering on the other side of the border kept improving. The equipment gap was known. It just hadn't been prioritized, because prioritizing it costs money, and 9 clean scans in a row looks, from a budget spreadsheet, exactly like success. Closing that gap took a request most agents never have to make: borrowing equipment from another port entirely. Through a coordination request between the FBI's McAllen Field Office and CBP's National Targeting Resources, Rivera's team arranged for a mobile backscatter imaging unit, technology capable of resolving finer density differentials than Pharr's standing equipment, to be brought in from a facility in El Paso for a single, targeted secondary inspection. The plan required precise timing. Bring the unit in too early, and a delay in equipment availability might tip off the network before agents were ready. Bring it in too late, and the trailer might already have made its Tuesday crossing and disappeared into Villarreal's warehouse before the new scan could be run. They had one shot at the right. Tuesday, November 12, 2024, early morning. The Tuesday trailer approached the Pharr Bridge inspection lanes on its normal schedule, driven by Ortiz, exactly as it had done roughly 60 times before. Nothing about the truck's approach differed from any prior crossing. Ortiz had no reason to suspect anything had changed. That was, deliberately, the entire point. CBP officers waved the trailer into the standard non-intrusive inspection lane. The image came back the way it always had, ambiguous enough on the standard equipment to require confirmation. This time, instead of clearing the truck, officers redirected it into a secondary inspection bay, where the borrowed backscatter unit sat ready. Ortiz was told this was a routine random secondary, a designation CBP uses often enough that it didn't, by itself, signal anything unusual to a driver who had crossed this exact bridge dozens of times before. The new scan took 11 minutes. It found what 9 prior scans had missed: a density anomaly inside the evaporator housing inconsistent with any standard refrigeration component, an irregular mass roughly 40 inches long, running parallel to the housing's outer wall. Agents didn't tear the truck apart at the bridge. Rivera's team had spent too long building a network case to blow it on one seizure. Officers cleared the trailer for a follow-up mechanical inspection under a pretext, giving surveillance teams already positioned near Villarreal's Pharr warehouse and near Valley Cold Chain Repair time to move into final position. That 11-minute scan closed the loop this whole story opened with. Not a smarter machine in the end. A machine finally aimed at exactly the panel Salinas had built to fool the older one, at exactly the moment agents were ready to act on what it found. What agents didn't know yet, standing at that secondary inspection bay, was that the coordinated operation about to unfold across 3 cities would also answer a question that had been sitting quietly in the case file for months. Who inside the inspection system had leaked scanner data to Salinas in the first place? At 5:40 the following morning, coordinated search and arrest operations moved simultaneously across 4 locations in the Rio Grande Valley. FBI and DEA agents, supported by Texas Department of Public Safety tactical units, hit Rio Fresh Produce's Pharr warehouse, Valley Cold Chain Repair's shop 3 miles away, a stash house in McAllen, identified through wiretap intercepts, and a second stash location in Edinburgh, tied to a distribution cell working downstream of Villarreal's network. Agents carried AR-15 rifles and moved in tactical vests, marked FBI, breaching 2 of the 4 locations within the same 90-second window to prevent anyone from warning the others by phone. The Pharr warehouse yielded the Tuesday trailer itself, now fully disassembled by an evidence recovery team working with tools designed not to damage the concealed compartment before it could be photographed and documented. Inside the evaporator housing, wrapped in coolant line casing exactly as Salinas had designed, agents recovered 340 pounds of compressed fentanyl. It was the smallest of the 4 seizure sites, but it was the one that proved the entire theory of the case. The McAllen stash house held considerably more. Behind a false wall in a converted garage, agents found 1,100 pounds of fentanyl in various stages of packaging, along with pill press equipment and dye used to color finish tablets. The Edinburgh location held another 660 pounds, along with financial ledgers. Handwritten in a code, investigators would spend weeks decrypting, tracking driver payments disguised as repair invoice amounts across at least 6 different Rio Grande Valley shell businesses. Total recovered across all 4 sites: 2.1 tons of fentanyl, with an estimated street value investigators placed at roughly $47 million for that seizure alone, against a pipeline prosecutors would later argue had moved more than $580 million in product over its operational life. Villarreal was arrested at his home in Pharr without incident. Peña was arrested at Valley Cold Chain Repair, phone still in hand, reportedly attempting to call a number that turned out to belong to Zavala's Reynosa-based communications relay, a call that never connected because agents had already cut the shop's landline and cell signal boosters minutes before entry. Ortiz was detained at a checkpoint north of Pharr, having crossed the bridge that morning without any idea that the warehouse waiting to receive his cargo no longer existed as a functioning operation. Zavala himself was not in the United States that morning. He remained, as of the case's public announcement, in Mexico, named in a sealed portion of the federal indictment, but outside the reach of the arrest operation. That's not the ending true crime stories usually promise, and it's worth sitting with that honestly rather than smoothing it over. 14 individuals were named across the unsealed indictments filed in the Southern District of Texas: Villarreal, Peña, Ortiz, 2 additional drivers identified through fuel card cross-referencing, 4 employees of the McAllen and Edinburgh distribution cells, and 5 individuals tied to the shell businesses used to disguise laundering payments through Valley Cold Chain Repair's invoicing scheme. Charges ranged from conspiracy to distribute fentanyl, knowing it would be imported into the United States, to money laundering conspiracy, to structuring financial transactions to evade reporting requirements. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface, and it's the part that made the case matter beyond one seizure. The remaining question, the one Rivera's team hadn't answered on raid morning, was how Salinas had originally obtained real scanner output detailed enough to engineer a compartment that could defeat it. That question didn't stay open for long. Roughly 7 weeks after the initial raids, a parallel thread of the investigation, run by CBP's Internal Affairs Office working alongside the FBI, identified a former contractor who had held a maintenance and calibration role on non-intrusive inspection equipment at a different South Texas port between 2021 and 2023. That contractor, who is not being named here because charges in that matter remain separately pending, is alleged to have sold calibration documentation and sample scanner output to intermediaries with cartel connections for a total of roughly $85,000 over an 18-month period. The documentation didn't include live crossing data. It included something arguably more dangerous: exactly how the equipment's density thresholds were calibrated, and exactly what kind of shapes the software was trained to flag as anomalous. That's the answer to the question this story has been circling since the second minute. Salinas didn't guess his way to a working hide. He reverse-engineered the machine's blind spot using documentation somebody was paid to hand over. The scanners weren't beaten by cleverness alone. They were beaten, in part, by a leak in the system meant to keep that exact knowledge contained. Here's what strikes us most about this case. Once you step back from the raid footage and the seizure numbers, it isn't the fentanyl, and it isn't even the leak. It's how long a boring, well-run front operation can outlast a system built entirely around flagging behavior that looks unusual. Villarreal's genius, if you can call it that, wasn't hiding drugs. It was making Rio Fresh produce genuinely, verifiably boring for 3 straight years before the Tuesday trailer ever carried its first brick of fentanyl. Patience was the actual weapon here. The compartment just made use of the trust that patience had already bought. Most people assume a smuggling operation this large would need a network of corrupted officers on the payroll at the bridge itself, someone waving trucks through on command. The evidence in this case says otherwise. Investigators found no evidence that any CBP officer working the Pharr inspection lanes knowingly allowed the Tuesday trailer through. The scans were read correctly, by the definition the equipment gave them. The corruption, where it existed, sat one level removed, in a calibration document sold years earlier and hundreds of miles away. Put yourself in Elena Marsh's position for a second. You're assigned a stack of loan fraud filings on a Tuesday afternoon. Nothing about your job description says drug trafficking. One invoice has a date that doesn't match a GPS log, and you could reasonably close that file and move to the next one, because it's not what you were asked to look for. What would you have done, sitting at that desk at 11 at night, deciding whether one mismatched date was worth another hour of your evening? Marsh pulled the fuel card data instead of closing the file. Everything that followed, the wiretap, the backscatter unit, the 4 coordinated raids, traces back to that one decision to keep looking a little longer than the assignment technically required. Assistant U.S. Attorney Bradley Kim, who took the case to the federal grand jury in the Southern District of Texas, would later describe the invoice discrepancy in court filings as the single thread that, once pulled, unraveled a pipeline this office had no independent knowledge of 18 months earlier. That's not exaggeration for a press release. Before Marsh's review, the case simply didn't exist in any investigative file. It was a suspicion invented out of a spreadsheet. Would this operation have eventually been caught some other way, without one analyst's stray curiosity about a repair bill? It's worth asking, and it's genuinely hard to answer. The scanning technology gap at Pharr wasn't scheduled for an upgrade cycle that would have closed it for at least another 2 years, according to procurement documents later obtained through the case's discovery process. Without the financial anomaly, the Tuesday trailer might have kept running on its original schedule well into 2026. What do you think? Did the system catch this case, or did one person's refusal to stop reading a boring spreadsheet catch it, in spite of a system that was structurally unequipped to notice on its own? That's a real question, and it's one worth sitting with rather than answering too quickly. The forensic accounting work that followed the raids took nearly 4 months to complete. Investigators eventually reconstructed the full financial architecture of the laundering scheme, and it turned out to be more elaborate than the invoice date discrepancy that first exposed it. Valley Cold Chain Repair issued invoices to 6 different produce and trucking-adjacent businesses across the Rio Grande Valley. Each invoice padded above the actual cost of any repair work performed. The padding amount, typically between $1,200 and $2,800 per invoice, represented disguised cash payments to drivers, brokers, and mid-level logistics coordinators working for Zavala's organization. Peña would deposit the full invoice amount, keep a small service fee for his own operation, and funnel the padded difference back out in cash through a network of small cash-intensive businesses: a laundromat, a used tire shop, and a small event rental company that had no operational connection to trucking at all, beyond serving as a place for cash to disappear into legitimate-looking receipts. Prosecutors estimated the laundering scheme moved approximately $2.3 million in disguised payments over its operational life, a figure far smaller than the $580 million pipeline valuation attached to the fentanyl itself, but a figure investigators considered disproportionately important because it was the laundering layer, not the drug layer, that eventually exposed the whole structure. That distinction matters, and it's worth explaining plainly rather than gesturing at it. The drugs were hidden well enough to beat 9 scanning attempts across 14 months. The money wasn't hidden nearly as well, because money has to move through a financial system that leaves records, tax filings, invoice dates, fuel card timestamps, no matter how carefully the physical product is concealed. Every drug trafficking case eventually has to answer the same question a legitimate business does: where did the money go? That question is much harder to obscure permanently than a compartment inside a refrigeration unit. The trial preparation phase brought its own complications, the kind that rarely make it into a headline but nearly derailed months of investigative work. 2 weeks before Villarreal's scheduled arraignment, a confidential informant who had agreed to testify about the Edinburgh distribution cell's internal structure withdrew cooperation after receiving what prosecutors described in a subsequent protective order, filing only as a credible and specific threat communicated through an intermediary. The informant's testimony had been expected to establish direct links between the Edinburgh cell and Zavala's Reynosa command structure, links prosecutors otherwise had to prove through circumstantial financial evidence alone. Kim's office adjusted strategy, building the conspiracy case around the paper trail Marsh and Rivera had already assembled, rather than relying on a single witness whose safety could no longer be guaranteed. It meant a more complicated trial presentation, built on invoice dates and fuel card timestamps instead of a cooperating witness pointing across a courtroom. It also meant a case less vulnerable to collapsing if any one person changed their story or disappeared before trial, which, given what had just happened, felt like the safer foundation regardless. Ortiz, the driver, agreed to a plea arrangement roughly 5 weeks after his arrest, cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentencing recommendation. His cooperation confirmed details investigators had only inferred from surveillance and financial records: that he had been told the trailer carried nothing unusual, that his debt to Zavala's organization had grown from an initial $4,000 loan to over $60,000 across 3 years, through compounding interest terms he described as impossible to actually pay off, only to keep owing. He testified that he never opened the evaporator housing himself and had no technical understanding of what Salinas had built inside it, a detail prosecutors used to argue for a reduced culpability tier at sentencing relative to Villarreal and Peña. Salinas was never apprehended. As of the case becoming public, he remains at large, believed by investigators to be operating somewhere in Tamaulipas state, continuing to design concealment systems for other cartel logistics cells. That loose end sits uncomfortably at the center of this story, and there's no way to resolve it into something tidier than it actually is. The engineer who built the compartment that beat 9 scanners is, as far as anyone official has confirmed, still out there building the next one. Peña pleaded guilty to money laundering conspiracy in March 2025, receiving a sentence of 9 years in federal prison. In his plea colloquy, he offered a statement that closely echoed the wiretapped phrase that had first captured investigators' attention months earlier. He told the court he had believed right up until his arrest, that paperwork was safer than cash. A belief that turned out to be true for years and catastrophically false the moment one analyst decided to check a single date against a single GPS log. Villarreal went to trial in June 2025 rather than accept a plea agreement, betting that the largely circumstantial financial case couldn't overcome reasonable doubt without a cooperating insider testifying directly to his knowledge of the concealment scheme. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all 6 counts, including conspiracy to import fentanyl and money laundering conspiracy. He was sentenced to 27 years in federal prison in August 2025. Here's the take that will probably split this comment section, and we'll say it plainly rather than dance around it. 27 years for the broker who ran the front company versus 9 years for the man who spent years building a full-scale cash laundering apparatus disguised as a repair shop. Peña's cooperation earned him a shorter sentence, and cooperation deals exist for good structural reasons. They help prosecutors build cases against bigger targets. But there's something uncomfortable about a system where the man who built the machine that laundered nearly $2.5 million in cartel cash across 6 shell businesses for years walks out in under a decade, while the front-facing broker who never personally touched a dollar of that laundering scheme gets nearly 3 times the sentence for the same underlying conspiracy. Reasonable people can disagree about where the greater culpability sits. We're not convinced the sentencing gap reflects it accurately. Would you have sentenced it differently? That's not rhetorical. Tell us in the comments whether cooperation should buy that much of a gap or whether it undervalues who actually built the machine. The most lasting consequence of this case wasn't any individual sentence. It was the inspection protocol change that followed within 4 months of the raids. CBP's Office of Field Operations, working with engineers who had studied the Salinas compartment design in detail, issued updated density analysis guidance to non-intrusive inspection teams at 3 Texas crossings, Pharr, Progreso, and Hidalgo, specifically instructing officers to flag any evaporator or condenser housing signature showing irregular density patterns inconsistent with standard refrigeration hardware, regardless of how the surrounding cargo scanned. It was a narrow fix aimed at exactly the blind spot this pipeline had exploited, and investigators involved in the case have been candid that it will not close every future gap. Salinas, wherever he is presumably already looking for the next one. We cut a fair amount of detail from this story for length, specifically around how investigators eventually decrypted the handwritten ledger codes found at the Edinburgh stash house, a process that took a cryptographic specialist nearly 3 weeks and involved comparing the code against seized ledgers from an entirely unrelated 2019 case. If you want that part told properly, in its own video, say so in the comments. We read every one, and if enough of you want it, we'll go build it. 14 indictments, 2.1 tons of fentanyl, a $580 million pipeline exposed not by a smarter scanner, but by a woman who kept reading a spreadsheet after her job technically told her she could stop. 9 machines missed it. 1 invoice didn't. If this kind of case is the reason you're here, the reason a repair bill can matter more than a raid, subscribe, because we're building an entire archive of investigations like this one. And there's a lot more of the border you haven't seen yet.